Grief and trauma is never neat or understood easily. Given our circumstances around the loss or the trauma and our personal history with the object or the person that we've lost, the world of people who have loved and lost is pretty much a maze. In this video, I would like to get into the depths of grief and beyond. So what do I mean by beyond? By beyond, I mean that I will touch on how grief takes us to the bigger unresolved questions of life, what to expect in the reality of loss from an existential perspective, and how to deal with it if you choose to face it or are forced to face it. Now, we have various models that attempt to describe and understand and treat complicated grief and trauma journeys. But the reality is usually far from what we see on paper or learn from books. But it is still very important to remind ourselves of the nature of grief, which has been well studied for centuries. So as many of you know, grief can look like denial, anger, depression, acceptance, guilt, numbness. And there are just so many models and understandings of grief that are out there. All you have to do is type in grief into Google and you'll probably be aggrieved by the information out there. But that's what it is, right? These theories and these models, they give you the information, they give you a dissected, identifiable framework of the possible emotional turmoil. But it cannot illustrate the mess, it cannot predict the time, and it cannot lay out the structure of the emotional roller coaster that grief will take you on. And in the modern world, thanks to many psychologists and psychotherapists, we understand grief in phases and in stages that we go through, where grief is a singular event, where you experience shock, denial, anger, sorrow, and eventually you get to acceptance, which is undeniably the hardest part of all. But the idea is that you make sense or you make meaning of the loss somewhere along the way and you move forward with life. Today, I would like to focus on something a little different. I would like to briefly address the types of grief, explore the depths of grief from a more personal angle rather than what grief can look like. And I also want to address what to really expect and how it can transform you like trauma does, for better or for worse. Now, to grieve is not just about the sadness you face when someone you love is no longer in your life, whether it is a relationship breakdown or a death. We grieve over so many situations. We grieve over our loss of friendships. We grieve over our lives and how things were before COVID. We grieve when we move cities or countries. We grieve over our abilities or the loss of our abilities, of our health, of our cognitive or physical function. But grief and loss is not limited to our personal losses. Loss is shared when you are social animals. And so we are also greatly impacted by our loved ones, and much more impacted when our loved ones lose their faculties. We grieve together as well over financial losses, the loss of livelihood. We grieve over the loss of independence. We grieve over the loss of sovereignty. We grieve over the loss of freedom. And while we grow to be resilient throughout all these losses, many of these losses are very hard to stomach, and they take a long time to process as well. But why is that? Well, that's because our sense of self is being challenged when it comes to grief and loss. how we interact with the world is different. We're no longer the same person as we were before the loss, whatever the loss might be. We have been transformed by one of the most ubiquitous, universal experiences of humanity. And most of the time, grief and loss happens to us. We often don't seek out for it because, let's face it, it sucks, it hurts, and it is an unwelcome change. A lot of the times, grief and trauma evokes blame. And so the blame and shame game begin. We blame the actors involved, we blame ourselves, we blame our loved ones for doing things and for not doing things. We are ashamed of how we acted or didn't act. We blame God, we blame the universe, because we cannot and do not want to comprehend how such tragedy is even imaginable. And we're angry. We begin searching for answers rationally and even spiritually. And it's a process that we must endure. The existential torment, the rage, the frustration, these are almost like the obstacle course laid out before us. And the worst part is there is no way out, only through. If you skirt around it, then you suffer other complications that are associated with suppression of grief, for instance. And at this point, you have to allow yourself to feel the anguish over and over again for as many times and however long it takes before finding that deeper sense of acceptance. Reflecting back on my experiences of bereavement, and bereavement is when someone you love dies, I recall having multiple emotionally charged conversations with friends and with family members about the poor interaction we had with the medical community whilst my mom was ill, where we were short of information and falsely reassured of the mortality of my mother. And just thinking about it and talking about it right now, I can already feel the heat rising in my chest. Sometimes in retrospect, we realize how incapable we are or we can be to process information and to listen to our own intuition in an emotionally stressful situation. Our initial reactions may be too alarming, and it might have led the medical staff to err on towards caution, or perhaps bad news were not broken to us in the most sensitive ways, or perhaps the most explicit way, so we missed the point. Things like medical confirmation bias and gaslighting by others can get in the way while we're experiencing anticipatory grief. And it's almost like we lack the capacity we normally would have to even notice such things because of the love that we have for who or what it is at stake. So because we're emotionally drained or stressed, we miss the fact that, you know, we might be experiencing some form of confirmation bias or echo chamber, or we might be, you know, gaslit by, you know, people around us about the truth of the situation. Maybe people close to us are not accepting certain things. And so it makes it easier for us to not accept and be in denial. And so when we're working against the Goliath of healthcare systems or oppressive individuals or other members that are involved with the loss, who might have more power over us, whether individually or together, it's important to remind ourselves that we too are actors of our losses, and to also be compassionate with ourselves, because there's only so much bandwidth we have at the time, given with what we know at the time and the resources that we have at that time. Always look for a second or a third opinion, even if it costs more, even if it's outside your insurance coverage, because peace of mind is invaluable. If seeing a non-conventional psychotherapist allows you to speak the same language, discuss things openly and seriously, despite how incredulous they might sound, go for it. If you think that it is really important to engage with someone with cultural sensitivity or awareness, engage for a culturally aware therapist. I personally struggled greatly as a third culture kid or a third culture person who, have been raised as a Muslim from Southeast Asia, who studied in secular international schools for half of my education, who's also in the field of psychology and counseling. I found that I couldn't find reprieve from engaging with certain counselors. I found that it was hard because I needed my therapist to understand the cultural and the religious and the philosophical nuances and aspects of my upbringing, my ethnicity, and also understand that my outlook of the world has also been heavily influenced by my education. I felt that I could not go to a religious leader like a priest or an imam because I thought I knew that their words would not really bring me comfort, that it might do the opposite. Eventually, I was lucky enough to find a psychologist who could really engage with me on a deeper level with my grief. And I'm really grateful for that because cultural awareness and the understanding, the sensitivity when it comes to therapy was never something I ever took for granted ever since then. Since I've had that experience with that particular psychologist, the comfort and the space that he had with me where I could toss out all sorts of crazy ideas and philosophies and questions, deeper spiritual questions, and my doubts, and express fits of grief and rage, all that being contained by that same person. It was rare to find that person as a professional, and I've appreciated that ever since. In the same vein, if seeking alternative therapies is something that's on your mind, definitely do explore it as well. Inform yourself, talk to people, and find as much information as you can. If spirituality is a dimension that is fertile ground for your existential inquiries, explore it with as many people and as much literature you can get your hands on, because as Numan Ali Khan says, regret is a form of punishment itself. So try your best not to stumble into its jagged teeth. Now, if any of these resonate with you, please share your thoughts in the comment box and subscribe to my channel. Now, another important thing I want to highlight is post-traumatic growth. At some point, when you take a different lens or perspective, this can cause your ego to take a hit, which is a good thing sometimes because that's what needs to happen for us to heal. So with every grief spell or flashback, what I try to do is either make some meaning from it or learn from it. Because at the end of the day, there's no map of grief. There are some commonalities, but there's no comprehensive manual to guide you through it. All you have is the day that presents itself. And in that day, you cannot really predict what the universe is going to throw in your way. You might be able to meditate on issues that need to be resolved, or you might not even be in that headspace that day. Eventually, if you allow yourself to face the pain along with the facts and along with the fluctuating circumstances, you might be able to hoist yourself up to a higher level of spiritual understanding towards acceptance. A good question to ask yourself when reflecting upon this is, how can I transcend this pain to a higher level of spiritual understanding? Because the truth of the matter is all these things are constantly battling with the given situation to have it take shape. And it's like you're almost helpless in getting a direction. And this leads us to consider the concept of surrender. It's when you can't control anything and you have to almost let the higher universal powers take charge of it and see where it leads you. After a while, you might realize that surrender is quite a peaceful place to be in. Now, having said that, be mindful that I do not mean avoiding your responsibility to process the hardship, but rather to see how far your agency can go and relinquishing yourself from the burden when objectively you know that there is nothing much you can do. I would also like to reiterate that trauma and grief differs for everyone. Recovery is unique. Why? Well, it depends on a few things like your past experience, your cognitive abilities, the developmental stage when loss and trauma hits you, your spiritual position and beliefs, your experience in recognizing what helps, and also your strengths that have helped you overcome things in the past. Ultimately, it is about having a deep acceptance of the duality of the nature of life and death, having a deep acceptance of the duality of the nature of a beginning and an end, having a deep acceptance of the duality of the nature of health and sickness, and having a deep acceptance of the limits of our comprehension and our agency. Now, another thing to know is that there will be triggers, and these triggers will show up in the least places you expect them to. I remember learning this from an old friend of mine who came to pay his respects at my mother's funeral. And that was the only piece of advice he had for me. He had also lost his mother 2 years before that. And when he told me that it will hit you when you least expect it, I didn't really understand what that would be like, because at the time I was just consumed with grief. But only later it made sense when, the acute grief has passed, life was starting to happen. There will be the most unexpected spells of grief that happen out of the blue from a random trigger. Like for me, it was seeing a mother and her adult daughter walking together on a bridge, or finding Milo in the supermarket shelf. These two events I remember sent me into a heap of bones on the ground and into a puddle of tears. Later, I learned a little bit more about the nature of grief, and I realized that this was actually a common phenomenon. But then you have to learn, right? Okay, well, this is just another small lesson in my progress towards a final state that I might not even reach. And that final state is called acceptance. So I've shared some bits and pieces of my journey, but I cannot claim that I have reached a complete state of surrender and acceptance. It's a work in progress, and there have been and will be speed bumps along the way. And to me, that is becoming more normal. And I know that surrendering and accepting is the general direction I should go towards. Now, finally, I find that being a grief and a trauma therapist by helping others with their emotional wounds has also had a powerful healing impact on mine. And I simultaneously draw upon my own wounds as a source of empathy, true understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. Brooke Lilith said that to heal thyself, embrace your wound as your sacred teacher. There's a lot of science and spirituality behind healing yourself and others, but I'm not going to get into that today. But what I will say that what I will say is that it is a pleasant surprise, as pleasant as surprises can be in grief and trauma, because I never feel alone in my struggles. And I constantly feel grateful for having the love and the memories that I have. And with that, I was also able to treat myself gently and with compassion as I do with others. So if you have any other tips and ideas about navigating grief, please share your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd also really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel so that whenever I have a new video on psychoeducation, you'll be notified. And of course, if you'd like to connect with me, you can visit my website or drop me an email. Until next time, bye.